So we're back here again talking about the Voltage Multistage 10, and there's a new function which we didn't have in the original VMS, which I want to talk about and build a patch around today. And basically, there's a function when you boot these up, whether it's the 16, the 10, or the 8, where if you hold strobe, this LED illuminates, and now we're in the so-called strobe mode, which is booklet parlance for being able to use an external voltage to control the playback head, essentially the sequencer. So you can see as I move this knob, the analog knob here, we're scanning backwards and forwards through the sequence. So basically what we're going to do today is use that as a starting point for a much larger patch, trying to get some interaction between different speed sequences. But the actual thing that's different in the 10 and the 16 compared to the original VMS is that in this mode, we now get gates from the gate out, and it's due to it being based on transistor circuitry rather than CMOS. Can't go into the details of that myself. You'd have to ask Mark, but basically now we get gate outs when we're doing this sort of thing, which is a pretty big deal if you like doing the sort of patch that we're going to build up today. And again, it's going to take a while. Might sound pretty trash at the beginning, but hopefully by the end, it'll feel like you got something out of the video. We'll see. Yeah, so just to start off, so we're using the modulating oscillator from the complex oscillator as like the main playback control of the VMS 10. So we can see it's going backwards and forwards. And we now have our gate outs, which we will use to trigger an envelope, which we'll use to control the volume of something later on. While you guys weren't watching, I was programming these sliders semi-laboriously so that they'd make some melodic content, which we're going to use to control the pitch of the harmonic oscillator. So first of all, I want to mult all those signals because we want to use them multiple times. So bear with me while I do that. So our A row on the 10 is going up here. B row to here. The 16s will put in the other mults. Oh, that was embarrassing. Yeah, there we go. Bottom one here, bottom one here. And we, of course, need a way to have them being routed to the oscillator one at a time. So I'm going to plug them all in to our friend the sequence selector, MVP for most useful module to make things more interesting, at least in the context of our systems. So just putting these all in a row, 10 A and B, then 16 A and B, and I'll leave one blank just so we have some moments with no pitch. And so all this row gets mixed down to this one output, which I connect to the CV input of the harmonic oscillator. So, and I also need this to move. So I'm going to use one of the gate outputs from the BMS 10 to the advance, and this is now going to move around. So let's set up the audio part of the voice. We're going to start simply with the harmonic output into an amp and tone, and then down into the multi-delay, then back up to the scan and pan for our output. And we need to connect the envelope here as well. Now we can see we're getting some action on here. So what does this sound like? And the rate of this. So the rate of this is being controlled by the complex oscillator here. Of course, this isn't moving at all yet. And so what I want to do is make a relationship between the rates of these two sequences. So I'm going to take the output of the A row and get it to modulate the rate of this sequencer. So I'll just hit play now. So they're on these two inputs here. So you can hear this sort of trilling effect because the rate of this is not the same as the rate of the gate outputs coming out of this sequencer. So it's going to lead to a certain type of variation that we're after. Okay, so what should we do now? So this is kind of like the basis for everything, and it's all an elaboration on this starting point. And the first thing I want to do is make the rate of this more interesting, or somehow influenced by what's going on with these guys here. So I'm going to take the A row of the 16 and get it to modulate the rate. So now we've stopped because I'm doing a negative modulation. So I'm going to slow it down and add positive modulation. And now we can begin to hear this push-pull relationship between the rates of the sequences and the oscillator. And so this essentially becomes like our performance control, if you want to call it that. So we can have the rate faster here, but then do negative modulation. So we can essentially stop the whole thing when it gets so slow. Nudge it back into motion, etc. So I think it's time to make this sound a bit more interesting. So the first thing I want to do is modulate the envelopes. So I'm going to take the reference output of the 10 to the quantized randoms on the random sampling, and I'm just going to go straight in without any attenuation here. So top output to the attack, and I'm going to do the bottom. Yeah, so we're getting longer notes there. And this should interact nicely with the type of interaction we already have established here. Modulating envelopes, always good for making things sound less like a synthesizer. And yeah, so now we're basically just going to keep using our extra rows to modulate other stuff. See if we can get these nice interactions emerging now. So first I want to turn on some of the different partials of the harmonic oscillator. So we'll take the B row of the 10 to center. So now we're going to get extra high frequencies in different frequency ranges. Yeah, so we're looking for this slowing down, speeding up kind of rubato type relationship. And now I also want to use the saw output and filter it through an amp and tone and put it through the bark filter. So while I do this, I'm just going to turn down the harmonic oscillator so we can focus on this for a second. And I also need gate outputs for this, so I'm going to get the gate out from the 16 and might have to use a black one for this, to the exponential input, and that's going to the bark filter, I can see, and then we patch the bark filter into the multi-delay. Yep, and we can't hear very much right now because the filter is very closed. So I'm going to use the A row of the 16 to open the filter. And I also want to modulate the envelopes of this voice as well. So I'm going to take the ref output of the 16 to trigger the sample and holds and put one of the fluctuating randoms in there. Chuck one straight into the attack and one into the decay. Okay, so that's sounding better now. Now let's get the bark filter doing something, because we still have the B row of the 16 here. I'm going to put that in the width. And get another one, oops, on center. Okay, so let's turn the harmonic voice back up. So I just slowed everything down there quite a bit. So just the final thing I want to do is basically a rip off of one of Tom's techniques, who you've seen him in other videos. And I want to take different preset outputs from the multi-delay, stick them into the second row on the sequence selector, and then use them as feedback, which is going to give us different sort of rhythmic variations to the sound. So this also means I need to route the harmonic oscillator into the bark filter so that I have, because I still want to use the reverb here. If I plug the feedback straight in here, we lose the reverb. So I'm going to carefully turn up the feedback once I get this plugged in. That's what we call feedback. So we can hear these feedback trails now. Let's switch it off. And just to, this might not be to everyone's taste, but we can also modulate the delay time here, which is going to make everything sound much more atonal. Sounding like a modular synthesizer now. Yeah, and so whether you were doing this for sound design or whether this is the basis of all the music you make, basically from this point all you're doing is interacting with or changing the relationship between all the different rates of the sequences, and then occasionally chance things happen like that. Like that feedback was way too loud because we landed on a certain step and then stayed there for much longer than we were before. So if you're into these sort of like chance, well, it's not based on chance, it's based on actual relationships between things which are repeating, but can be pretty fruitful for interesting sort of, yeah, rubato, but electronic type sounds. But I'll take this delay modulation out so it sounds a bit more pretty. Yeah, that was more or less it. I hope it made some sense and was of some interest, and hit us up if you got any questions. Ciao.